Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and I'm really pleased to have back on the line with us Dan Sisson. He's the co-author. He's actually the author. I did some editing and wrote, kind of an introduction and a final chapter. But Dan wrote the first edition of this book back, what, 30, 40 years ago, Dan?
40 years ago.
Yeah, The American Revolution of 1800, how Jefferson rescued democracy from tyranny and faction, and what this means today. Dan Sisson, historian Dan Sisson, and also adjunct faculty member at Eastern Washington University, where you teach the history of technology in the engineering department. Dan, welcome back. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Tom. It's good to be back.
So, I started out the program today citing a Time magazine article that was quoting Steve Bannon, or that was quoting a guy who worked with Steve Bannon, who was in one of Steve Bannon's movies. About how Bannon had read The Fourth Turning, and he got these every 80-year cycles of revolution and change in America. And he talks about how President Obama is, like, on the record as saying, well, we really don't want that. We want to maintain institutions, and my job is not to be the revolutionary president, and it's rather to kind of hold the ship together and just keep going slow and steady. And my words, not his, but, to that effect. But that Bannon really believes in this, 80 years ago was the Great Depression, World War II. 80 years before that was the crash of 1857, followed by the Civil War. 80 years before that, the crash of 1700 in the 1776 and all this. But there was this American Revolution of 1800, too, where Thomas Jefferson was really a revolutionary. How do we understand revolution? We've talked before about faction, but how do we understand revolution in today's time, particularly the possibility of an autocratic or even fascistic revolution that might be being planned by folks in the incoming administration?
Great question, and it's on a lot of people's minds. And I think that if we start to look closely at your preface, in which you were reading from Madison and Hamilton, what you see is that the big concern of most of the framers was that faction would destroy the systems of government that we had around us. And so when you look toward the Constitution, you see that one of the things that the framers believed was that they could erect a form of government that would have a lifetime because it was based on the principles of human nature. And I believe that Jefferson's Revolution of 1800 was an attempt to renew that Constitution. If you read his first inaugural, you would see at the end that he says, whenever we fear for our safety, we must go back and turn to the Constitution to re-inform ourselves about what we believe in. And so the revolution that I see taking place today is one in which Mr. Trump, our president-elect, seems to have almost a contemptuous air about this Constitution and really doesn't know anything about it. One of the most revealing comments that I've seen is a former CIA officer, Evan McMullen, who wrote an editorial for the New York Times, in which he talked about he was the chair of the Republican Policy Committee, and he's meeting with Mr. Trump, and they're going to talk about their relationships. And one of the women congressmen asked Mr. Trump, what is your view of your role in this transition? How are you going to make sure that the first article, which gives us legislative power in all areas, will be protected? And Trump interrupted her and said, well, I'm familiar with all that. And he says, and I know about those 12 or 15 articles. And therefore, and all of a sudden, the people in the room realized that Mr. Trump had no idea what the Constitution was saying.
Right. He obviously had never read it.
Exactly. Or at least he didn't think about what he read if he'd ever read it.
Right.
But the point is that he is not knowledgeable about protecting that Constitution. Furthermore, I look at the number of changes that he is bringing about with real alarm. I'll give you a couple of examples here. If you noticed throughout the campaign, both parties refused to talk about the environment. We had 3 presidential debates in which not one serious round of questions was about the most important issue facing humanity. This is by common agreement.
You're talking about climate change.
Absolutely. Climate change. And so here we are really jettisoning 400 years of the Enlightenment, and based upon science and reason from Descartes and Bacon and all the people that we looked up to during our history, and they have no relevance in Mr. Trump's world or in the world of the faction that dominates our councils. And I don't think that this is something that has just happened. In other words, he's talking about 80-year cycles. I think that the cycles might be a little bit shorter in America, but things move more quickly in the 21st century than in the 18th century. But when we realize that the Republicans say when Obama came in, the very night that he was inaugurated, we're saying we're going to make sure that nothing gets through, that he doesn't get any of his agenda in place. We're not going to compromise. These are the opposite of what the founders had envisioned for us in the future. We were to respect one another. One of the things that characterizes Washington today is that the parties don't respect one another. They have contempt for one another. In fact, you might even say that so many factions within those parties hate one another. And this is not the way that you bring about decent government. And the founders probably had a better take on human nature than almost anybody that we see today. At the Constitutional Convention, for example, I think about Ben Franklin, and Franklin said there's two impulses that activate human beings, two passions in a sense. One is ambition, and the other is avarice. He says the love for power and the love of money. And if there are two words which I think characterizes this revolution more than anything that's happened in the last 150 years in America, it is the frequency with which we talk about the nature of power and how much money is made by the people that are in power. And if you look at Mr. Trump's incoming cabinet, I heard some figures that say that they represent, in terms of total income, almost 30% of the wealth of the American people.
Yeah, total wealth, yeah.
Yeah, 15 or 16 people. And so we're looking at plutocracy at the very least. We're also looking at what you might call authoritarianism.
Well, hang on just a second. How do you respond then to people who say, yeah, but the founders and framers were the plutocrats of their day?
Well, I'm not so sure that all of them were. I think that, you've got two or three of the leading spokesmen from Pennsylvania in that group that were, they weren't poor, but they were educated. And if you were an educated man in an aristocratic society, you did have access. But I would say that the most important thing is what you were reading, when the program started. And that is they were capable of making distinctions about politics that we no longer make today. For example, Madison is making a distinction between party and faction. We talk about party today as it's synonymous with faction, if we even use that word. And we're paying the penalty for 2 or 3 generations of scholarship that refuse to make a distinction between party and faction the way that the framers did. As you mentioned earlier, faction is destructive. It's vile. It's
faction is a group of people who are working in their own self-interest to the detriment of the country, by using James Madison's definition, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And if you plug in what I just said about Ben Franklin saying it's the love of money and power, then of course you've got a dynamite combination here. Right. And so our scholars, and this goes way back for 75 to 100 years. I think Bernard Balin from Harvard is the only exception. They don't deal with the word faction. They look at it as an antiquated notion. They only talk about parties, and we've celebrated parties, and we've never tried to look beyond that in terms of our political behavior. And I think that this is really vital now, and it's coming back to haunt us, because most Americans think about the party structure, but they don't go beyond that, and they don't look for those trends or those actions which would be destructive to our total constitutional system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So I'm going to run this segment long here, Dan, so that I want to get you in as much as possible so we don't break it up. What do we do about that? I mean, I think your point that people don't understand the difference between faction and party is huge, and that's the failure of the education of civics over the last 50 years or more, if nothing else. And probably one of the things that animated you to write this book, I'm guessing. We're talking with Dan Sisson, by the way, who's the author of The American Revolution of 1800, How Jefferson Rescued Democracy from Tyranny and Faction, and what this means today. In the 2 minutes or so we have left, what is the appropriate response to this? How do we go forward?
Well, how we go forward depends. We're going to have to somehow break that majority that controls the Senate, the House, the Supreme Court. I don't know, literally, we just had an election in which the president-elect claims that he got a majority, and there were all these other illegal votes that were taken without any evidence. We've got a very mixed up political dynamic here. We've got a media that is interested in money, like Franklin said. I mean, I think about Lester Moonbase at CBS, and he said when told that Trump makes a rear end of himself, every time he speaks, he says, we love it because every time he does, we make $10 million. Right. And the conclusion was, we're in this for the money, and we're not concerned about the ideas. And this is having a major impact on the way that people respond to the candidates, to the ideas that we have running for office, and what's going to happen in the rest of the country. I mean, let me go back to this thing about the environment for just a second, because I think it's critically important. Mm-hmm. Mr. Trump has said he's going to make America great again. If you analyze that concept, it seems to me that he's talking about economic growth as being the savior of America. And he's going to impose this on corporations. He's going to make them bring jobs back from overseas, etc. This is a kind of a simple-minded notion of what can possibly happen. It destroys what Republicans have principles they've originally stood up for over 100 years now, which is a separation between the government and the economy, having the notion of individuals and their businesses being freed from the government. And he's collapsing that as we sit here, at least in terms of rhetoric. And we're not, nobody's saying a word about this, hardly. When I look at his emphasis on the growth, it seems to me that when we look at the climate change, we see that growth in the world economy is producing more pollution. We're going in the complete opposite direction. Every one of these people that he's appointed to his cabinet seems to have an investment and be on the record as saying they don't even believe in climate change. So we're rejecting science here, big time. I mean, Jefferson and Franklin and others who were scientists of the first order would be absolutely appalled by the direction that we're taking here. And I don't see where we can do anything about it.
Yeah. Well, I think we can. It's called organize, organize, organize.
Well, that would be Jefferson's prescription. You have to start at the lowest levels, right, and recruit free. But let me point out to you that one of the sins of the Democratic Party in the last 3 to 4 years has been that they have not spent very much money at all on doing things that would help local party development, bringing that party along. Right. The Republicans done a much better job, and they have gone into the states. They now control some 30 plus states. And I see that as the next battleground in terms of what we're going to do. They've already got Jefferson's message, but it's a message that is infused with the politics of faction, because they're after power. They're not concerned about the blacks and whether they have access to vote, and they're not concerned so much about the laws, and neither is Mr. Trump. Yeah. When you look at the records, we're talking about some serious...
it's all about the power and the money. Dan, we're out of time, but Dan Sisson, the author of The American Revolution of 1800, a great Christmas gift, by the way. Dan, thanks so much. Appreciate you being with us. We'll be back.